characteristics of the house too. If it's a newer house, then the insurance rates are less. It depends on the type of roof, how old the roof is, when the electrical was done. I don't want to say, pride of ownership, the condition of the home. So they can, they can see things. We have technology now, and so they can see, if you have debris around your house or if your roof is at the end of its life. They're asking for receipts to show that you actually updated your home. If you've done those things, then the rate isn't going to impact you as much. But if you haven't, then you're looking at much larger increases. It is going to affect every single Californian that owns property.
And in terms of insurance, like the value of having insurance, I come from Iran, where a lot of people don't have we don't have an insurance industry like we do here. And when you lose something, it's gone for good.
Right.
And what's the value that this insurance industry is delivering to us Californians here?
It's allowing regular people, not the top 1%, to own property. We have to go to the bank because most of us don't have $1 million to go buy a house just sitting in the bank. So instead we leverage it by going and putting a mortgage against the house. Investors help us buy the house. Well, the investors aren't going to continue to allow us to use their money for any cost if they don't have something that's going to guarantee if something happens to that piece of property that they'll be repaid in full. So it's going to basically stop the economy. We need insurance for, not only is this affecting auto and home, whenever you have this type of a crisis, if an insurance company is losing money in one type of business, say homeowners insurance, then it affects they tighten up the underwriting requirements on a business. So what they do is make it harder to buy insurance and more expensive if you're a business, because they have to make money somewhere in order to keep paying the people and paying the claims. So it'll stop the economy because we won't be able to buy a house because people won't be able to get a mortgage because they have to have insurance to buy a mortgage. A contractor won't be able to step into your building without showing that they have insurance because you don't want to take the risk on for something that they might cause. And so that's just a snowball effect, right? It's going to affect the economy, which really is frustrating to me because it seems to me the government would want us to continue the economy to keep flowing because the taxes keep coming in to pay them, to pay for all the things that they're voting for us to pay, all the social problems and all of the other things we're paying for. We can't continue to do that if we don't have a viable economy. And this is something that can crash our economy. If the insurance companies say no more, we're not going to write any insurance in California anymore, it will stop everything here because we won't have any type of collateral, anything for the investors to feel safe. Insurance has been going on since the ships came over from England to the United States. The investors didn't want to have their cargo go out unless they had some kind of guarantee that they would get some of their money back if the ship sunk or was pirated or any of the other things that happened. So it's a very, very old and basic tenet to any type of economy.
So Chris, you have been in this business. This is the third generation business. You guys have been in insurance. What was it like before, and how does all this make you feel?
It's always been about helping people. We want to make sure they have the right coverage in the event something happens. And as you can imagine, over the last 75 years, we've had several houses burned to the ground. We've had some massive car accidents and some very scary situations that were always covered by insurance because we always wanted to make sure we take care of them. And this is the very first time in the history of our agency that we can't always find insurance for people. And that speaks to the availability issue. It makes us feel horrible to tell someone on the phone, oh, I can't find insurance for you. You don't have an option. You can't get insurance. And so that's a tough go. So that's
California legislator.
What's frustrating right now.
Are you worried about the business? Are you worried that you guys could survive in the long run?
I try not to think about it too much, but yes, I do. but I try not to dwell on it because it's not going to help, you know, with what we're doing right now. We're doing the best we can. We're taking care of the people that we can take care of.
If you like the show and our content, you should go to insiderca.com and sign up to our newsletter, because we never know what can happen with social media and other platforms in terms of distributing our content.
Question. Washington recently stepped up restrictions on imports from China's Xinjiang region, using a law targeting forced labor in China. 2 more companies have been added to the U.S. blacklist as a result. Despite all the heated moments, Chairman Gallagher said that both Republicans and Democrats are fighting for the same cause. Reporting from Capitol Hill, Sam Wong, NTD News.
And while lawmakers debate their approach to China, the regime has been courting prominent Americans outside of Washington. Today, veteran U.S. diplomat Henry Kissinger meeting with China's Xi Jinping. Here to discuss the significance of moves like this is Brandon Weichert, a geopolitical analyst, senior editor at 1945.com, and the author of Winning Space: How America Remains a Superpower. We spoke earlier today. Brandon, great to have you on the show. Kissinger, who's not representing the American government in an official capacity, received a much warmer welcome from Beijing than John Kerry this week. Beijing seems to be taking a kind of approach where they'll selectively engage with Americans who it perceives as friendly, such as Kissinger, such as Bill Gates, for example, whose company has a long history in China, rather than through official diplomatic channels. What do you think is behind these moves, and do you think that it's a deliberate strategy here?
Yes, hello. Thank you for having me. It is absolutely a deliberate strategy, and if we were smart, we would not follow that strategy. Clearly, Beijing wants America to do a deal, but they want it to be on their terms, so we should not be meeting them at all midway through this. But unfortunately, Joe Biden is going to do a deal, and Taiwan is going to be left out in the cold. You can rest assured of that.
If we come back to Kissinger, he long championed the idea of inviting China to the international order, of fostering its growth so that it can become a responsible stakeholder. But now that China has become one of the biggest threats to the U.S., do you think that was the right approach to take?
I think the last 40 years of U.S. foreign policy toward China, since accepting Mao's invitation to open up to them, has been an unequivocal disaster, and it's going to lead us to a third world war, and it could very well lead to America's first military defeat in combat.
The China threat is increasingly recognized as a bipartisan issue within the U.S. now, and both parties are likely to try to appear even tougher on the regime as the general election approaches. How do you see that impacting the U.S.-China relations going forward?
Appearances are often deceiving, and I think that there's a lot of talk about standing tough and a lot of signals about being tough for the consumption of American voters. But I think China knows fundamentally they're going to get a deal with Biden on global warming in particular, which will have effects for the whole country, not just on global warming issues, but on trade, on economics, all of it. And in order to do that, they know they're going to be able to extract the
Biden is China's bitch.
Basically downplaying its commitments to Taiwan, and that's exactly what Beijing wants. And you have to elect a Republican, either Trump or DeSantis, who's hawkish on China and who won't, basically give in to China at the first push. And right now what we have happening is, Biden's putting on a big show of being Mr. Tough Guy, but it's just a show. Whereas with Trump, we actually have a history of his 4 years in office standing up to China on Taiwan. That was the first thing he did in the transition in 2016, standing up to China on trade with agriculture. He got an actual deal out of China that was beneficial to American farmers in the long run and hurt China, standing up to China on tech. So we have candidates out there running for office in 2024 who, if elected, will stand up to China and will force them to be that responsible actor that Kissinger assures us they will be, but they won't be unless we hold their feet to the fire.
Brandon Weichert, thank you so much for that.
It's their biggest target market and the biggest market in the world. And they work that very hard. And sort of on his way out the door, President Clinton got that through Congress with a lot of Republican help, Democrats and Republicans. A lot of Democrats opposed it, and some Republicans did. And it was probably the biggest single mistake the United States ever made in economic policy. Now, maybe an economist here can come up with something else, but I certainly can't. And then once that happened, you had this certainty. So the models that people would use would show granting what they changed the name because it'd be easier to sell to permanent normal trade relations instead of MFN, most favored nations, because it was just a sales thing. But they changed that name, and before granting that, the deficit, whatever it was, $20 billion range, which in and of itself was unacceptable because they were really a developing country, and we should have we shouldn't be running a big deficit with a developing country, but like that.
Why would you say that? Why shouldn't we be running a deficit?
Well, because what should be happening in a developing country relationship is we should be buying primary material from them, selling them manufacturing goods. We should then have a trade surplus, which should be used to invest there and develop that country. So we should be exporting savings to a developing country, not the other way around. So, and it's how it would normally be. It was how it was in the United States when we were developing with Great Britain and the like, right? They had a surplus with us. And that would be the normal way you would look at it. But so the models would say, that there would be a slight increase, or slight decrease in our trade deficit. In fact, it exploded because the models just didn't take into account the real world. And very soon we were running $120 billion trade deficit with China. And a lot of it initially was U.S. companies shifting their manufacturing there. And then the Chinese state planners then created an ecosystem, drew other manufacturing, began to do all the kinds of things you would expect them to do with technology, including forcing technology transfers and stealing technology and the like. And pretty soon that number grew and grew and grew and grew to the point where it was last year $380 billion, which is like unsustainable. It's a horribly large deficit. But in our years, it was quite large too. And we put in place tariffs, and it began to come down. And then COVID hit. And when COVID hit, there was all this money pumped into the system, this $1 trillion that we did to try to keep the economy going. So you have the pumping in of kind of consumer demand and a shutdown of manufacturing, and the result was to get the trade deficit back up again. And then, of course, the Biden people spent a couple of $1 trillion just for stimulus, and then, of course, the trade deficit exploded. And I should say that the trade deficit, we talk about the number, but we actually don't know what it is because there are some technicalities that I won't get into, but there's a huge amount of what is sold by China to the United States is unaccounted for. It's because of the way we keep our statistics. So individual packages don't count at all. And those packages can contain up to $800 worth of product. So that was something else that was sort of stupid and was passed in 2015. But no one had any idea what would happen. And now it's 2 million packages a day come from China that we don't know what's in them or what the real value is. So the number, instead of 380, might be 480 or 580. And so, I mean, it's like a huge number. And then if you add on top of that, whatever value you assign to technology transfer and technology theft, which is in the hundreds of billions of dollars, you can see pretty quickly the economic growth of China is largely a wealth transfer from the United States. And that's one of the things I try to say when people look at the challenge between the United States and China. I mean, people have their own categories of what they look at. For a lot of people, it's national security, right? But for some people, it's human rights. I mean, there's a whole variety of things people look at in this challenge. But they'll conclude that this is a problem, and then I'll come in and say, oh, well, then we shouldn't transfer $600, $700, $800 billion to them every year, and they'll like, well, what do you mean? No, what's wrong with that, right? I'm saying, yeah, are you listening to your self-talk, right? If you know you have a problem, and if you are basically fueling the problem, then you need a policy change, and that basically is what I talk about.
As being worker-centered, all right? I forget the exact term used, but focused on the American worker and their well-being, their flourishing. And I guess I want you to tell me what that means. What does that look like?
So first of all, free traders would say, they wouldn't say this, but their thinking is the most important thing is consumption. So we want to optimize prices. The cheapest television is better. We want to optimize prices, and that's kind of a side benefit, which some of them would talk about. So I wouldn't optimize corporate profits, right? My view is that's totally wrong. First of all, we don't have a lack of consumption problem in America, right? If anything, we have too much consumption. Let's just be honest. So price optimization doesn't do much to lure me, number one. Number two, I view Americans first as producers and not as consumers. And when I say as producers, I mean there is a dignity inherent in the individual that comes from work and supporting his or her family, and making a contribution to society, right? That has actual value. And we've kind of lost a little bit of that. And it goes back, Leo the 13th and Reb Navarre talked about this. And one of the other examples I like to give is St. Benedict. It was ora et labora, because it would be the Latin, pray and work, right? I mean, work is an important part of what it means to have self-confidence and to have a good opinion of yourself and to have your children have a good opinion of you. So we've kind of lost that. So, my view is we have to think of ourselves as producers first. So we need good jobs, more jobs, higher pay. I'm all in favor of trade. I think we have to have trade. One of the things I say in the book that's been quoted in some reviews is that trade is good, more trade is better. It's essential that it be fair, but it absolutely has to be balanced. You just cannot transfer wealth overseas. So you run up these high trade deficits by focusing on consumption. The net of it is that you're transferring the wealth of our children and grandchildren and their children overseas. And it's a foolish policy. We both lose the jobs and the wealth, and it's not good for us.
Well, and so what does balance really mean? Is it just as simple as, on average, there's no surplus, no deficit between the countries, or what does that mean?
So if you talk about trade deficits, for years, people said they don't matter, that it's just the other side of the capital account. We can talk about that. I would say, first of all, that trade deficits, bilateral trade deficits largely don't matter. It's the multilateral now. The only reason I would say mostly don't matter was because clearly a bilateral trade deficit, for example, between the United States and China, favoring China, that's transferring technology, that's clearly, so there's a component of it. But as a general matter, you can say bilateral deficits don't really matter. And you can say having a deficit one year and a surplus the next doesn't matter, right? I mean, who cares? But what we have seen in the United States is decades of trade deficits of hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, the classical economists would all have said, had you asked them, they would say that's not possible, so don't worry about it, it can't happen. But yet it has happened. For whatever reason, our currency hasn't adjusted and other things have happened, so that the United States has basically become the consumer, the end consumer for all products all over the world. And when I say the United States, it's by far the biggest part is the United States, but it's also, and tell me what these countries have in common, the UK, Canada, and Australia. Those four make up the vast majority of all the deficits. So in our case, which is what I focus on, the United States has these enormous deficits. And once again, bilateral, okay. One year, okay. But if you have decades where you're transferring, in our case, trillions and trillions of dollars over the course of decades, that is not acceptable anymore. And you have to get back to where you sell about what you get in. And there's three ways really to do that. I wrote an article in The Economist a couple years ago that really drafted on a piece that Warren Buffett, who I greatly admire, that Warren Buffett wrote in 2003. His approach would be, because he saw the same problem that I see, his approach would be get export certificates. and import certificates. So you want to import sweaters from China? Good. Give me an export certificate of someone who exported something, and that way you'll get balance trade. Another is put a capital access charge, right? Where if the money's coming back into the United States, charge them a fee so that they can't buy 100 cents worth of stuff when the dollar comes back, and that'll get you to balance. The third way, I think, is tariffs, and I would accept all of them tomorrow at 9 o'clock. I'd be happy. But I think tariffs is kind of easy for people to understand. You can adjust tariffs and get to the point where you have balanced trade.
So you said something interesting. You said, by definition, if we're running this massive deficit over decades, we're being taken advantage of. The response to that is simply, hey, we're getting all this great stuff, right? We, in a sense, we're taking advantage of people.
So let's analyze that. So this is what's in this article. What happens to these trade deficits? All right, these surpluses for the other countries. Ultimately, that money comes back to the United States, and this is why they say it's the other side of the capital account, the economists. It comes back to the United States in the form of purchasing equities, debt, or real estate, right? So it's all going to come back here. So a way to think about this is we are getting these T-shirts and third and fourth televisions cheaper, but we're paying for it by transferring assets of our country overseas. All right, so that's a bad deal. That's not a good deal. In many cases, it's current consumption for long-term loss of value. So you say, well, how big a problem is it? When Mr. Buffett wrote his article, this number, which is called the net investment position of the country. Net investment position means how much all Americans own all over the world versus how much everyone in the world owns here, right? And you can imagine from most of our history, that was a very large positive number. That number, when he wrote his article now, almost 20 years ago, was a negative $2 trillion. It's now a negative $17 trillion. So, to give you an idea, $17 trillion, you could buy most of the 100 biggest companies in America, and that's how much other people own versus what we own. And that is a net transfer of wealth that no one had ever done and thought even possible in the history of the world. And what we get in return is cheaper T-shirts. And it's a fool's bargain.
Fascinating. Something very central to this. You talk about, the ideology of free trade. You describe it almost like a faith or almost like a quasi-religion or something like this. And indeed, when I think about tariffs, I find myself having some sort of negative, visceral response to this. I realized I've been watching how I've been trained to believe certain things. Well, I've been trained to believe that free trade is structurally good and correct somehow along the way. And you're arguing that this kind of deep belief has played a significant role in all this.
But I think that's right. I think it's a false religion. But the first way to think about free trade is it doesn't exist anywhere in the world. There's literally no place that it exists in the world. And the notion that people say, here's something that I believe will happen in a petri dish, somewhere in a lab, and doesn't happen in the real world, and I think it's good. My first reaction is, we'll never know, right? Because it's just a theoretical principle, doesn't really exist anywhere. Now, clearly, using tariffs can be bad or it can be good, right? If you're using them to get great surpluses and the like any other economic policy, that's probably a mistake, at least certainly in terms of the general good. But free trade doesn't exist anywhere. Nobody practices free trade. And for sure, if you look at the great countries that run the big surpluses, they don't have free trade. China doesn't have, it's not remotely, it's not even capitalism. So, and Germany doesn't have free trade. Europe doesn't have free trade. It's all just, a false god. It just literally doesn't exist. But as I say, it's like anything else. You have to be wise about how you do it. Tariffs can be good. Tariffs can be bad. That's just like subsidies can be good. Subsidies can be bad, right? All these things depends on how they're used.
Well, no, this is the perfect opportunity to ask you about how the Chinese economy works in your view, and it's how incredibly different it is from this economy. A lot of people will say, well, in the U.S., there's a lot of what you would call corporate welfare. There's subsidies to certain kinds of industries that are being promoted. There's, farms. Anyway, all this kind of stuff happening. Okay, but we have capitalism here. China is actually kind of similar to that. This is what some people would say, right? China's actually it was communist once. These days, it's very different. It's
Are they
capitalism with Chinese characteristics.
bold?
You said it's not even capitalist. So how does the Chinese economy work today?
In the first place, they say they're socialist with Chinese characteristics. No one would say capitalist with Chinese characteristics, unless it was someone who was heavily invested there and making lots of money and wanted to be a shill. So how does their economy work? Their economy is as close as you can get to a planned economy. They have one of the great things about China is that they tell you what they're doing. It isn't like there's a mystery. The only mystery is people aren't willing to look. So they have a plan. They have state-owned enterprises. They gear productive access to them, and then they have I call them state-controlled enterprises.